Hi everyone, and I hope you're all well and welcome to all new subscribers. Keep on coming and supporting this channel. Okay, in part 1 we had a look at the engine chosen by Lotus for the Evora. Now here in part 2 we'll be having a look at the transmission that Lotus chose. Lotus did have the capability to produce their own, but sadly not the time or the budget. So as the engine was from Toyota, why not the transmission? One small problem: Toyota didn't use a manual transmission with the 2GR FE in any of its cars. So Lotus had to look at what they did have available, and the gearbox chosen was the EA60, as fitted to the Toyota Avensis and the Auris. In these cars they were joined to a 4-cylinder diesel engine. Now that may not sound like a good choice for a sports car, but it means they can handle a high torque load of over 400 Newton meters, which is handy as the Evora GT430 pushes out 450. The early Evoras used standard gear ratios as used by Toyota, but the gearing was a bit long and did not suit a sports car. These were called the long box at the factory, and it was soon realised that closer ratios were needed. So the sports ratio box was introduced as an option, and this would become standard on all Evoras with the introduction of the Evora S in 2010. There are still some cars out there with the long box, all normally aspirated, which is good for cruising and better fuel consumption. I will be telling you how to identify these gearboxes apart later in the video. The gearbox has a 3-shaft layout with 1 input shaft and 2 output shafts, which meant it has a shorter case, which is useful as the Evora subframe, where the powertrain will fit, does not have an excessive amount of room. Also, having 2 output shafts means it has 2 final drive ratios. As this gearbox was not designed to fit the 2GR engine, Lotus had to modify it so that it would. So how did Lotus do this? First thing was to make the gearbox fit the engine. This was achieved by manufacturing a cast alloy machined adapter plate to join the gearbox and engine together. The gearbox casing was machined and an adapter fitted to accept a smaller Hitachi starter motor. So that's a gearbox and engine joined together. Now, a clutch was needed. As the 2GR was never designed with a manual gearbox option, it never had a flywheel. One of the Lotus powertrain engineers told me the best solution would be to manufacture a dual mass flywheel. But unfortunately, the budget didn't stretch to this, and the Lotus engineers had to come up with another solution, which of course they did. Now the 2GR engines are shipped from Toyota in Japan to Hethel and supplied with a kit of parts to dress the engine. A lot of these parts are thrown away as they are not suitable for Lotus application. But as this engine is used only with automatic gearboxes in Toyota, it comes with a flex plate fitted to the crankshaft to bolt a torque converter onto, which is handy as it has a ring gear and it's somewhere to bolt a flywheel to. So Lotus went to AP Racing and commissioned a bespoke flywheel and a clutch plate and a clutch cover. This was all bolted to the flex plate, and a clutch release bearing from a Toyota fitted with a spacer. That was it. Job done. All very cost effectively, but unfortunately not perfect. The Evora S was fitted with a new low inertia flywheel and a new lighter heavy duty clutch. The Evora 400 series, including the 410 and 430, would get a revised clutch centre plate, cover and flywheel. Clutch diameter was increased to 240mm to handle the increased torque of the engine. The flex plate is the same across all the engines. Clutch life can be variable depending on how the car is used, but on average about 20,000 miles is pretty good. Bearing in mind, to change the clutch, the rear clamshell has to be removed, the engine and gearbox then has to be removed as one unit and split on the floor to get to the clutch. Labour time for clutch is about 21.5 hours, and that's on a good day. I'm afraid Lotus did not look at the serviceability when designing the car. I certainly hope they do with the new Evora, for the sake of ownership and warranty costs. So that's the clutch covered. Now we'll have a delve about inside the gearbox. Okay, as mentioned previously, this gearbox was designed to be fitted to a diesel engine, so Toyota was not too worried about the mechanical noise it made. In other words, it's mechanically noisy. Any of you watching this who owns an Evora or an Exceed will know this. With the car stationary and the engine idling, it clatters, and driving in first and second, it's not exactly silent. This noise is mostly covered by the blanket statement of "it's a characteristic," used by Lotus for years to cover things that they know about but won't do anything to improve it, as it would cost money and is generally not a safety issue. Some early Evoras, however, did have a problem. The noise was excessive, partly due to the clutch centre plate, for which Lotus released an updated one as a running change, but there was a problem internally with the gearbox. This was due to a spacer fitted between the two gears on the input shaft. This would start to move, and eventually the two gears would start rocking on the shaft and eventually strip the internal splines. The first rectification was a shouldered spacer, but this still gave problems. Eventually a one-piece gear and spacer was fitted, and this is not such a problem now. So what else did Lotus do to the gearbox? As mentioned earlier, there was an option of a sports ratio gearbox offered, which is now standard. Lotus would strip the gearbox and fit closer ratio gears on 3rd, 4th, 5th and 6th. To identify if an early NA gearbox has sports ratios fitted, Lotus stamped some numbers on the casings. Here on the transmission casing and here on the transaxle casing. If it's got GB followed by numbers, it means it's a sports ratio. In 2015, with the introduction of the Evora 400, it was decided to fit a limited slip differential. This would improve traction all round. Lotus chose to use Quaife automatic torque biasing diff, which is a fit and forget LSD. No clutches, ramps or springs to service, bang it in, job done. So that's the gearbox itself covered. Not a bad gearbox, but in my opinion, in the 12-year life of the Evora, a better alternative could have been found. I do hope that when the new Lotus Evora is launched, which is said to share the same powertrain from the Evora, they will offer a DCT as an option and not just the EA60. As this is going to be one of the last internal combustion engine cars from Lotus before electrification, at least fit a gearbox that it deserves. They can't use lack of funds as an excuse now. It is rumoured that the 4-cylinder variant of the Evora will have a DCT gearbox, which I suspect will come with the engine chosen. So why shouldn't the V6 get the same treatment? One of the talented Lotus service agents in Austria, Jubu Performance, has already done this for the Evora and the Exceed. So come on Lotus, if they can, you can. So we've had a poke about in the gearbox. Let's have a look at what else Lotus did with areas like gear change and cooling. Let's have a look at the gear change first. All cars up until 12 model year were fitted with cables supplied by a company called Cofli in Italy. These cables can become tight over time and make the shift a bit difficult, necessitating a cable change. They are identified as being grey in colour. From 12 model year, Lotus switched to a company called Ringspan in the UK. These cables were a larger diameter and improved the quality of the shift and identified as being blue in colour. Now a lot of people asked at the time if they could fit the later blue cables to their early cars to improve the shift. Simple answer is yes, but it's not a straightforward job as the gear change assembly and fixing methods are different. There's a lot to take out in the interior just to access the gear change assembly, which then has to be modified to fit the cables. I must say the cables are quite sensitive to adjustments. Get it wrong and it's horrible. With the introduction of the Evora 400, the gear shift took a big jump. Gone was the all-in-one gear change and brake assembly unit, and this was replaced by a nicely engineered alloy gear shift assembly separated from the handbrake assembly. At the back end, the up and over the top of the gearbox cable layout was changed. This new layout worked much more efficiently and made the gear change so much better. Those of you who have driven an early Evora and then a 400 series car will know what I am talking about. Lastly, on the manual gearbox, an oil cooler was added with the introduction of the 410 Sport in 2016. It was found that if the vehicle was pushed hard around the track, the gearbox oil would reach or exceed the recommended temperatures. And it was pushed hard by Gavin Kershaw, then the manager of Vehicle Dynamics Group. I have to say, if anyone can push it hard, Gavin certainly can. So Lotus had to devise a gearbox oil cooler. Now the Lotus engineers cleverly used a part that was usually thrown away with the kit of parts that came with the engines from Toyota, as I mentioned earlier. This was an oil to coolant heat exchanger. An adapter was fitted to the oil filler hole with a pickup pipe in the gearbox. The oil then goes to an inline filter, through the pump, up to the heat exchanger where heat from the oil is absorbed by the coolant. It then goes back into the gearbox through an adapter fitted in the unused speedo hole. And around it goes again until the temperature drops to the required level. The ECU controls the pump function via a temperature sensor fitted in the gearbox. And this is what it all looks like in reality. So that's the manual gearbox and all its bits covered. Right, so now we'll have a look at the automatic gearbox that Lotus fitted to the Evora. Now this would be the first auto option on a Lotus since the Lotus XL back in the 1980s. The choice was an easy one. The gearbox was the U660E, a 6-speed electronically controlled torque converter type transmission. So why was this an easy option? Simple really, because this gearbox is the gearbox that Toyota usually fit to the 2GR FE engine, so no adapting required. But Lotus did certain things to make it more suitable for the Evora. Lotus didn't want a manual gear selector lever as fitted on the Toyotas, so an electrically operated shift was required. At the gearbox end, a bracket was fitted to the gearbox and a shift actuator was fitted to this. Then a rod assembly was fitted to join with the lever on the gearbox. The shift motor is supplied by a company called Dura and has a little Peugeot lion stamped on it. Not the first time Lotus has used Peugeot sourced parts. In the car, a push button panel was fitted. This looked much better in the car than a gear lever. Lotus also fitted paddle shifts to the steering wheel, and these are Toyota parts. Lotus Powertrain also wrote their own calibration for the gearbox to make it more suitable for a sports car, and eventually, after a lot of work, the gearbox shifted like a sports car, and in my opinion they did a bloody good job of it. The gearbox works well if it is treated properly and set up from day one of ownership. This gearbox from new needs to be driven for about 1,000 miles for the gearbox to adapt and learn. The gearbox via the transmission control unit is adaptive and is constantly learning how it is used. The TCU and ECU also talk to each other and share data as how the car is being driven. A word of warning: if you have your automatic transmission replaced, overhauled, or have a new TCU fitted or have it reset, it all needs time to learn and adapt. So for the first 1,000 miles approximately, drive it in auto mode mostly and do not exclusively use it in manual mode. In manual mode, the learn and adaptation element within the TCU is disabled. I've seen new gearboxes that have been fitted and driven hard straight away, and it will destroy the gearbox in about 1,000 miles or less. You may recall my story of the Auto Exige in China that was taken straight out onto a track without the period of learning. The gearbox was destroyed in about 2 weeks. Lotus offer very few serviceable parts other than solenoids, some sensors and some connectors. The gearbox is also quite sensitive to incorrect oil levels. I'll cover this in more detail in the maintenance part of this series. If any of you have any questions you'd like to ask me about the engine or the gearbox or anything else really, remember you can email me on the lotusguru56@gmail.com. Send me an email, ask me a question, I shall do my utmost to answer it. Thank you for watching, keep liking and subscribing, and until the next time, take care and so long for the Lotus Guru.